She signed under duress, Your Honor, and I have 3 witnesses who will swear to it. The courtroom fell so silent that Elijah Holloway could hear the blood rushing in his own ears. He stood at the front of Judge Clarence Aldrich's makeshift territorial court, which was really nothing more than the back room of the Dusty Creek Trading Post in Redemption, New Mexico Territory, in the spring of 1882. His tin star caught the lamplight and threw a hard glint across the pine-board walls. His jaw was set like quarried stone, and his brown eyes burned with something beyond duty. They burned with conviction that ran all the way down to the marrow. Across the aisle, Harrison Beckett sat with the easy comfort of a man who had never once worried about consequences. He wore a gray frock coat and kept a silver watch chain looped across his vest, and his lawyer, a narrow-faced man named Dalton Price, sat beside him arranging papers with quick, practiced hands. Beckett had the money, the land, and the connections that wound through every back office in the territory. And he had, according to the deed of transfer sitting on Judge Aldrich's table, the legal right to every acre of the Winslow homestead on the Rio Salado, except that Elijah Holloway was not going to allow that to stand. Marshal Holloway, Judge Aldrich said, peering over his spectacles with the exhausted look of a man who had hoped this particular morning would be simple, you are making an extremely serious allegation. Yes, sir, I am. Elijah's voice did not waver, and I can prove it. From the back of the room, near the door that let in the dry desert wind, there was a sharp intake of breath. Elijah did not turn around. He knew the sound. He had been hearing it in his memory for 3 weeks, ever since the night he had found Inez Winslow sitting on the cold ground beside her porch steps with her hands shaking and her dark eyes hollow, staring at a piece of paper she had just been made to sign at gunpoint. He had not been fast enough to stop it, but he had sworn to himself, with the kind of oath that a man makes only once in his life, that he would undo it. And today was the day. Let us go back to where it truly began, because a story this tangled does not start in a courtroom. It starts in the dust and the heat and the long silences of a territory where justice was still being invented, and where a woman's courage could be the most dangerous thing in the county. Redemption, New Mexico Territory, October of 1881. The Santa Fe Railroad had pushed its iron fingers westward and changed the geometry of ambition across the high desert. Towns that had been sleepy watering stops were suddenly choke points of commerce. Land that had been worth a handshake and a prayer was now worth more than a working man could earn in 20 years. And in the middle of all that recalculated worth sat the Winslow homestead, 460 acres straddling the cleanest stretch of the Rio Salado for 40 miles in either direction. Inez Winslow had inherited it from her father, Thomas Winslow, who had died of pneumonia in March of that year. She was 26 years old. She had her father's stubbornness and her mother's black hair and dark eyes, and she had grown up knowing every rock and mesquite root on those 460 acres, as well as she knew her own heartbeat. She ran cattle and kept a kitchen garden and hired 2 Mexican ranch hands, brothers named Tomás and Felix Reyes, who had worked for her father since before she could walk. She also employed a widowed woman named Ruth Aldcott who cooked and helped manage the house, a stout and plain-spoken woman of 52 who had seen enough of the world to be afraid of very little. The trouble began the first week of November, when Harrison Beckett sent his foreman out to the Winslow place with a sealed letter. The letter was a purchase offer, a generous one on its surface. $1,500 for the land and the water rights. It was enough money for Inez to start over somewhere easier. Somewhere without droughts and dust, and the backbreaking labor of keeping a cattle operation alive with a skeleton crew. Inez read the letter twice, set it on the kitchen table, and wrote a polite refusal in her careful, even hand. 2 weeks later, the offer came again. This time it was accompanied by a verbal message from the foreman, a hard-eyed man named Cord Delaney, who suggested that Miss Winslow might want to think more carefully about her neighbors and whether she wanted to stay on good terms with them. Inez wrote a second refusal, slightly less polite than the first. The water rights dispute arrived in December. Someone upstream on Beckett's land had dammed a tributary that fed one of the 3 wells on the Winslow property. The well went dry in 3 days. Tomás and Felix rode out to see what had happened, and they came back with the news that Beckett's men had built the dam and were not inclined to remove it. When Inez filed a complaint at the land office in the county seat of Las Cruces, she was told the paperwork was being reviewed. It was reviewed for 6 weeks without result. That was the winter she first met Elijah Holloway. He had arrived in Redemption in September to take over as territorial marshal after the previous man had gotten himself shot during a dispute over a cattle brand. Elijah was 32 years old, lean and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that needed cutting and a quiet manner that people sometimes mistook for slowness, until they realized he had already noticed everything in a room before they finished walking into it. He had served as a deputy in Dodge City for 4 years before that, and before Dodge City there had been the war, which he did not talk about, and a cattle drive along the Kisham Trail, which he talked about even less. He carried a Colt single-action Army revolver, standard issue for the period, and a Winchester Model 1873 lever-action rifle in the scabbard on his roan horse, and he wore his badge with the uncomplicated belief that it meant something. He was the kind of man who was constitutionally incapable of looking away from an injustice, which was either his greatest quality or his worst problem, depending on who you asked. He first saw Inez Winslow when she came into town to file her complaint about the dam tributary. She was standing at the land office counter in a gray wool dress and a wide-brimmed hat, speaking with the measured precision of someone who had prepared their argument carefully and was now discovering that no one intended to listen to it. There was a stiffness in her shoulders that was not arrogance but controlled frustration, and when the land clerk told her the 3rd time that the matter was under review, she straightened her back by another half-inch, thanked him with perfect courtesy, and turned for the door. Elijah had been leaning against the wall outside the land office, watching 2 cowboys argue about a horse on the other side of the street. He pushed off the wall when she came out and tipped his hat, and she stopped and looked at him with those dark eyes that seemed to be evaluating whether he was worth talking to. "You heard all that," she said. "It was not a question." "Most of it," he admitted. "And you're the marshal?" "Yes, ma'am." "Then perhaps you could tell me what good it does to file a legal complaint in this territory if no one at the land office intends to act on it." He thought about that honestly. "Not much good in present company," he said, "but I can ride out and look at the dam myself. That's within my jurisdiction." She looked at him for a moment longer, as though she were deciding how much trust to allocate to someone she had known for 40 seconds. Then she told him where the tributary ran and where the dam was, and she said his name was already known to her, because she had made it her business to know who held the law in Redemption. He rode out to the tributary 2 days later, which was a cold gray Wednesday in January. He found the dam exactly where she had said it would be, a competent earthen construction that clearly had not been built by accident or nature. He also found Cord Delaney sitting on a horse nearby as if he had been waiting, which he probably had. Delaney told him the dam was on Beckett land and was a legitimate improvement to the water management of Beckett's property. Elijah told him that legitimacy was a matter for the court to determine, and that in the meantime he was advising Mr. Beckett in writing that the matter was under investigation. Delaney smiled with his mouth only and said Mr. Beckett would be happy to speak with the marshal whenever the marshal had time. Elijah wrote the letter. Beckett responded through his lawyer, Dalton Price, with a 12-page document full of territorial land law citations. Elijah sent it to the regional land office in Santa Fe and waited for someone there to untangle it. In the meantime, he rode out to the Winslow homestead 4 more times over the course of January and February. The first time was to report what he had found at the dam. The second time was because there had been a report of riders on her north fence line at night, and he wanted to check it in person. The third time was because one of her cattle had been found shot, and he wanted to document it. The fourth time he told himself it was because he needed to ask Tomas Reyes about the timing of the riders, but the truth was more complicated than that, and some part of him already knew it. Inez made coffee on that fourth visit, and they sat at the kitchen table while the desert wind shook the shutters and Ruth Aldcott moved around the kitchen with strategic discretion, finding reasons to be in other parts of the house. They talked about the case, and then about her father, and then about the territory and where it was going now that the railroad had arrived, and Elijah found himself 2 hours into the conversation before he thought to check the time. She was not a soft woman. That was the thing that struck him. She was not soft in the way he had sometimes imagined a woman being, yielding and careful and grateful for whatever a man offered. She was precise and direct, and she had opinions about water law and cattle prices, and the territorial legislature that she held with the confidence of someone who had done the reading. She laughed exactly twice during those 2 hours, once when he described his failed attempt to cook his own beans on the trail the previous autumn, and once when she caught him mispronouncing the Spanish name of a local creek. Both times the laugh transformed her face in a way that made him want to say something foolish just to see it again. He rode back to Redemption in the early dark thinking about her, in a way that was not professional, and could not be made professional no matter how he rearranged it. He told himself it was not the right time. She was fighting for her land. She was under pressure from a man with more resources than she had. She needed an impartial marshal, not a man with a complicated heart. He told himself this firmly and repeatedly for the next 6 weeks, and it worked moderately well except for the fact that he kept finding reasons to ride out to the Rio Salado. The pressure on Inez escalated through February. 3 more cattle were killed. The hired man who had come to replace a seasonal worker she had let go in the fall quit suddenly, telling her only that he had received advice to find other employment. When she drove her buckboard into town to buy supplies, the proprietor at the general store was suddenly unable to extend her credit, which he had been extending without difficulty for 3 years, citing concerns about her business stability. She paid in the cash she had and drove home knowing that it was not going to last. She told Elijah all of this on a Thursday afternoon in early March, standing in the doorway of his office in Redemption while he sat at his desk, and listened with the particular quality of attention that meant he was not just hearing but cataloging. When she was done, he sat forward and looked at her steadily. "He's trying to drive you out without having to force you," Elijah said. "He wants you to give up and sell willingly so there's no legal trouble." "I know what he's doing," she said. "I need to know what I can do about it. You can document everything, every incident, every date and description. I'll countersign each report. And what good does documentation do when no one with authority wants to act on it?" It was the same question she had asked him the first day they met, and this time he did not have a better answer than he had then. But he held her gaze and said, "It does good when somebody finally decides to act, and I promise you that somebody is going to decide." She looked at him for a long moment. The late afternoon light came through the window and made a clean line across her jaw, and she looked tired in the way that came from too many weeks of not enough sleep and too many problems to carry. "All right, Marshal Holloway," she said, and she almost smiled, which was not quite as good as a full laugh but was still enough to make him momentarily forget what he had been thinking about. "I am going to hold you to that." March became April. Elijah worked every angle he could find. He wrote to the regional marshal's office. He wrote to the territorial judge's circuit. He documented every incident with meticulous care. He quietly interviewed neighbors, 2 of whom, a homesteader named Gerald Potts and a Mexican farmer named Andres Vega, admitted that they had received similar pressure from Beckett's organization, though neither was willing to say so formally. He and Inez fell into a rhythm that neither of them formally acknowledged. He rode out to the homestead twice a week. They discussed the case. They drank coffee, or in the evenings, the good whiskey she kept on the shelf above the fireplace, which had been her father's, and which she poured with a generosity that surprised him the first time. Ruth Aldcott still contrived to be elsewhere during these conversations, and Tamaz and Felix, who were not oblivious men, developed a habit of finding pressing work in the barn whenever the marshal's roan horse appeared in the yard. In the middle of April, when the desert was beginning its brief flowering, and the light had that particular gold quality that was unique to the high desert in spring, Inez showed him something she had not shown anyone before. It was a notebook her father had kept, a ledger in which he had recorded not just the financial workings of the homestead, but his observations about the land and its history. Thomas Winslow had been a man of unusual intellectual curiosity, and the notebook ranged from cattle weights to descriptions of the hawks he saw circling the mesas to a hand-drawn map of the water table below the property and where he believed the aquifer ran. He loved this land, she said quietly, sitting beside Elijah at the kitchen table with the notebook open between them. Not in a possessive way, in the way you love something that has taught you how to be alive. Elijah turned a page slowly. He read a few lines of Thomas Winslow's careful handwriting, observations about the behavior of the river during a drought year 4 years prior, notes about which soil held the most moisture. He was a remarkable man, he said. He was. She was quiet for a moment. I am not going to let Beckett have this land. I am not going to let everything my father built be consumed by a man who only wants it because the railroad made it valuable. She said it without drama or performance, and it landed on Elijah like a weight placed carefully and deliberately on his chest. He understood something in that moment about what he had been doing for the past 4 months, and why he had not been able to stop, and what it would mean if he tried. "You're not going to have to," he said. She turned and looked at him, close enough that the proximity became something different from what it had been. He could see the small lines of exhaustion around her eyes and a faint scar on her left cheekbone that she had told him once came from a fall off a horse when she was 12 years old. She looked at him with those dark, evaluating eyes, and whatever she found in what she was looking for seemed to satisfy some internal question she had been sitting with. "Elijah," she said. She had been calling him Elijah for about 3 weeks, and every time she said it, it did something to the architecture of his composure. "Yes," he said, "I think you may have been sitting in my kitchen twice a week for 4 months for reasons that are not entirely professional. That is a fair observation," he said. The corner of her mouth lifted. "What do you intend to do about it?" He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "I was thinking about asking if I could court you, in the formal sense, properly." She considered this with the same deliberateness she brought to every decision. "I think," she said slowly, "that I would find that acceptable, provided the marshal in question understands that I am not a woman who requires managing." "I had gathered that," he said, and she laughed, fully this time, the real laugh that made her whole face change. And Elijah Holloway, who had crossed a cattle trail in weather that would have stopped most men and faced down armed outlaws with steadier hands than most people possessed, felt something inside his chest rearrange itself permanently. He began calling on her. It was, by the standards of 1882, a traditional courtship, except that it was also threaded through with an ongoing legal dispute and the constant shadow of Beckett's campaign to drive her off her land. He brought her wild sage from the mesa and a book of poetry he had ordered from the mail in Santa Fe, because she had mentioned in passing that she had been reading Tennyson. She gave him bread from her kitchen, and once, memorably, let him help her repair a section of fence on the north pasture, while Tamaz and Felix watched from a respectful distance with expressions of careful neutrality. He told her about Dodge City, about the years of dust and violence that had made him believe, paradoxically, in the possibility of order. He told her about the war, in pieces and fragments, more than he had told anyone since coming west. She listened without flinching, and without the kind of pity that would have made it harder to continue. She simply received what he offered and held it without judgment. She told him about her childhood on the homestead, about learning to ride before she could properly read, about her mother who had died of fever when Inez was 15, about the years of running the place alongside her father, and the loneliness that had settled over the land after he was gone. She told him about her refusals to marry, 2 formal proposals before Beckett's trouble began, from men who were not bad but who wanted a woman who would become a supporting element of their own story rather than the central one of her own. "You are a particular kind of person," Elijah said one evening in early May, sitting on the porch with the desert night spreading out around them and the stars visible in a way that only happened far from town. "A difficult kind, some would say," she replied. "I was going to say necessary," he said. She looked at him in the dark and said nothing for a long moment. Then she reached over and put her hand on his, and they sat like that while the desert breathed around them, and it was one of the truest moments of his life. Then June arrived, and Harrison Beckett stopped being patient. The first sign was Delaney and 2 other men riding past the homestead 3 days in a row, close enough to the fence line to make their presence impossible to ignore. The second sign was a fire in the north pasture that burned an acre of grass before Tomás and Felix, and Inez beat it down with wet sacks at 2 in the morning. Elijah rode out the next dawn and documented the burn and the horse tracks leading away from it, and he sent another formal report to the regional marshal's office with language that he chose with deliberate precision, words like arson and systematic harassment and pattern of coercion. The response came back in 10 days. It was sympathetic and non-committal, and suggested that the matter might best be resolved through the territorial land court. Elijah read it at his desk in Redemption and felt something shift inside him, a frustration that ran up against his belief in the law like a horse against a fence. He understood then what Inez had been telling him since January. The law existed and was a good thing, but the men administering it at this particular moment and in this particular territory were men who had their own relationships with men like Beckett, and that web of relationships was going to continue blunting every formal instrument he had unless he found a different approach. He went to see Gerald Potts. Gerald was 61, a former schoolteacher from Ohio who had come west 20 years ago and built a life on 40 acres of stubborn soil. He had white whiskers and careful eyes, and he had told Elijah in March that he was not willing to make formal statements about the pressure Beckett had applied to him. This time Elijah laid out what had happened to Inez, the fire, the campaign against her credit and labor, the damned tributary, all of it, and he asked Gerald Potts what kind of man he wanted to be on the day he looked back at this. Gerald was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "All right, Marshal, I'll speak to what I know." Elijah went to see Andres Vega, who ran a small sheep operation 5 miles south of the Winslow place. Andres was 44 and had a family of 7 children and a quiet dignity that Elijah respected enormously. He had more to risk than Gerald Potts, and Elijah told him so directly, and said he understood if Andres chose not to speak. Andres looked at him and said, in careful, measured English that he had taught himself over 20 years, "The law in this territory has not always been a friend to men who look like me, Marshal. You are asking me to trust it now." "I'm asking you to trust me," Elijah said. "I know that's different." Andres was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Yes, it is different." He held out his hand and Elijah shook it. He had 2 witnesses. He needed to find the situation itself, the moment that would make the legal challenge possible. He did not have to find it. It found him on the night of the 17th of June. He was riding back from the eastern part of his jurisdiction, where he had been dealing with a dispute between 2 cattle outfits over a grazing boundary, when he saw the lamplight at the Winslow homestead from half a mile off, burning with the bright, concentrated quality of multiple lamps rather than the single light that usually indicated the house settling in for the night. He turned his roan off the main track and rode for it without thinking. He found Inez standing in the yard. The 2 lamps on the porch were burning, and Cord Delaney was there with 2 other men, one holding a horse and one holding a rifle in a casual way that was not casual at all. A fourth man stood at the edge of the porch steps. He was not Beckett, who would not come himself, but he was Dalton Price, the lawyer, and he had a document in his hand. Ruth Aldcott was on the porch, her arms crossed and her face pale with controlled fear. Tamaz and Felix were nowhere visible, which meant they had probably been sent out of the way or were being kept at the barn by someone Elijah had not yet seen. Inez had a pen in her hand, and the look on her face was the look of a person being forced to a choice under conditions that made all the options terrible. Dalton Price was explaining something in his measured lawyer's voice, and Cord Delaney was standing between Inez and the house door with his hand resting on his belt near the revolver he wore. Elijah came off his horse before it had fully stopped and was across the yard in 6 strides. "That's enough," he said. Price stopped speaking. Delaney turned. The man with the rifle made a slight movement that Elijah categorized instantly and responded to by settling his hand near his own revolver without drawing it. "Marshal," Price said, with the smooth recovery of a man trained to improvise, "this is a private legal matter. The Winslow property is being transferred by voluntary agreement of the owner." "Her hand is shaking," Elijah said. He kept his voice level. "And that man is holding a rifle at conversational distance. That is not a voluntary agreement. That is a forced signature." "This is perfectly legal," Price said. "Take your men and get off this property," Elijah said. "Now, tonight." He looked at Delaney with a directness that communicated precisely how much he meant it. "And if any of you are back on this land before I say otherwise, I will arrest every one of you for criminal coercion, which in this territory carries a prison sentence." The moment held its shape for a beat, 2 beats, 3. Then Delaney made a small signal to the others and they began to move. Price gathered his document, which he did not try to claim had been signed, and went to his horse. When they were gone, Inez sat down on the porch steps. The pen dropped from her hand and she folded her hands together and looked at the dark yard where Beckett's men had just been. Elijah sat beside her. He did not say anything immediately. He could see that she was not going to cry, because that was not how she was built, but the held-in quality of her breathing told him exactly how close to the edge of her capacity she was. After a while, she said, "He had a man at the barn with Tamaz and Felix. Told them if I didn't sign, there would be trouble." "I'll ride to the barn," Elijah said. "Ruth already went," Inez said. "They're all right." He stayed. He sat beside her on the porch steps under the spring stars, and after a while she leaned into his shoulder and he put his arm around her and held her while the adrenaline drained away and the night settled back into its normal sounds, the distant coyotes, the creaking of the mesquite, the soft movement of the horses in the pasture. "I almost signed it," she said quietly, "but you didn't. I would have if you hadn't come." He tightened his arm around her fractionally. "I came." She turned her head and looked up at him. In the lamplight her face was shadowed and tired and still, and he looked back at her with everything he had been carrying since January present in his expression, and she reached up and put her hand against his jaw and he bent down and kissed her for the first time, carefully and with the full weight of everything it meant. When they separated, she was quiet for a moment and then she said, "You realize he is going to try again." "He's going to try in court," Elijah said. "And I am going to be ready for him." But Beckett moved faster than Elijah anticipated. In the following 2 weeks, while Elijah was coordinating with Gerald Potts and Andres Vega and building his case, Beckett went to the territorial judge. Not the circuit judge, but Judge Clarence Aldrich, who held court in Redemption and who was, Elijah discovered with a cold clarity, a man who owed Harrison Beckett a significant personal debt from a business arrangement that predated Aldrich's appointment to the bench. Beckett's lawyer filed a claim in court stating that Inez Winslow had verbally agreed to the sale of her property and had in fact begun the process of signing the transfer document before being interrupted by a third party. He submitted an affidavit from Cord Delaney and from Price himself stating that the signing had been underway and nearly complete and that the marshal had interfered with a lawful private transaction. Inez received the court summons on a Monday in late June. She rode into redemption and came to Elijah's office with the paper in her hand and a steadiness in her face that cost her something to maintain. He read the summons. He set it on the desk. He looked at her. "I have Potts and Vega," he said. "But the summons is for next week. I need a third witness, specifically to the night of the 17th. Ruth was there," Inez said. "Beckett's lawyer will say she's partial." A household employee of the plaintiff. What about Tomás or Felix? Same problem, and they may face other pressures. He was thinking hard, turning through every person he had spoken to in 6 months of working the county. It was Inez herself who said the name. "The Calloway boy," she said. "He was there." Elijah looked at her sharply. "What?" "James Calloway. He's 20 years old, works for Beckett's horse operation. He was the man at the barn that night." She met Elijah's eyes. "He didn't want to be there. He told Tomás he was sorry. He came back the next morning and apologized to me in person." Elijah was already reaching for his hat. James Calloway was a lanky young man who had grown up in the territory without much in the way of prospects and had taken work with Beckett because it paid reliably. He lived in a bunkhouse on the eastern edge of Beckett's operation, and he opened the door when Elijah knocked with the expression of a man who had been expecting this visit and was not sure whether to be relieved or terrified by it. Elijah laid it out simply. He told James what he had done by coming back to the homestead and apologizing. He said that Act told him something about the kind of man James was underneath the work he had found himself doing. He said James could say nothing and hope it all went away, or he could testify to what he had seen, which was that Cord Delaney had stationed himself between Inez Winslow and her own door with his hand on his gun while her lawyer presented a document and pressure was applied. James sat with it for a long time, turning his hat in his hands. Then he said, "Beckett will fire me." "Yes," Elijah said, "he probably will." "And then what do I do?" Elijah looked at him levelly. "There's honest work in this territory for a man who wants it. Potts has 20 acres he can't properly manage alone. Vega runs sheep and needs a hand in the season. I'll speak for you to both of them." James looked at his hat, then he looked up. "What I saw that night," he said. "It wasn't right. I knew it wasn't right when I was standing there." "I know it," Elijah said. James nodded. "All right, Marshal, I'll swear to it. 3 witnesses. Gerald Potts, who would testify to the pattern of coercion against neighboring landowners. Andres Vega, who would corroborate the same. And James Calloway, who would testify to what he had seen with his own eyes on the night of the 17th. It was not a perfect case. Judge Aldrich was compromised. Price was skilled. Beckett had money and influence running through the territory like groundwater. But it was a case, and it was the truth, and Elijah had made a promise. He rode to the homestead the evening before the hearing. The desert was in full summer now, the heat pressing down from a copper sky, and the air smelled of dry grass and something blooming in the distance. Inez was on the porch when he rode in. She had been waiting. He tied his horse and came up to the porch and stood before her, and she looked at him with an attention that felt like being seen all the way to the interior of things. "We have 3 witnesses," he said. Something shifted in her face. Not quite relief because the hearing had not happened yet, but something approaching it. "Tell me," she said. He told her. She listened to every detail, and when he finished she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "James Calloway is a brave young man." "He is," Elijah agreed. She reached out and took his hand, and he held it, and they stood on the porch in the late heat and looked out across the land that her father had loved and that she had fought for with everything she had. And Elijah thought about what it meant to stand beside someone through something like this, and what it would mean to stand beside her for everything after. "Inez," he said. She looked up at him. "When this is over," he said, "I want to ask you something, not about the land or the case." She understood what he meant. He could see it in her expression, the small warmth that came into it, the way her hand pressed slightly harder against his. "When it is over," she said softly, "I think I would be very ready to hear it." He kissed her then, not carefully the way he had the first time, but with the full gravity of what they had been moving toward since January, and she kissed him back with the same directness she brought to everything, and the desert stretched out around them in the copper dusk without apology. The hearing convened the following morning at 9 o'clock in the back room of the Dusty Creek Trading Post, which was where we began. Judge Aldrich called the proceedings to order with a gavel that someone had made from a piece of railroad iron, which Elijah found symbolically appropriate given, who was ultimately behind most of the region's current troubles. The room was nearly full. Inez sat at a table on the left side with her own lawyer, a young man named Frederick Hale who had passed the bar in Santa Fe 2 years ago and who was smart and prepared and visibly nervous. Beckett sat on the right with Dalton Price, who was not nervous at all. Price opened with the argument that the transfer document had been in the process of being executed voluntarily and that the marshal had interfered. He submitted the affidavits from Delaney and from himself. He spoke with great fluency about the sanctity of private contracts and the importance of not allowing law enforcement to insert itself into civil commerce. Then Frederick Hale rose, and he was steadier than he looked. He presented Inez's testimony about the events of the 17th, her clear and precise account of the men in her yard and the gun, and the ultimatum regarding Tomas and Felix. He submitted the documentation of the fire in the North Pasture, and the dammed tributary, and the interference with her credit. He laid it out methodically, and when he was done he looked at the judge and said, "Your Honor, the evidence establishes a sustained pattern of coercion designed to make Miss Winslow's position untenable and to force her compliance. The events of the 17th were not a voluntary agreement. They were the endpoint of a 6-month campaign of pressure." Price objected. He objected to the relevance of events prior to the document in question. He objected to characterizations. He objected with the practiced fluency of a man who had been paid to prevent the truth from becoming the organizing principle of the proceedings. Judge Aldrich sustained several of the objections with an ease that told Elijah everything he needed to know about the judge's orientation that day. Then Elijah rose from his chair in the back of the room. "Your Honor," he said, "I have testimony to present." Price started to object. Aldrich looked at Elijah with the cautious expression of a man calculating whether he could afford to ignore the marshal of redemption in a room full of witnesses. Elijah did not wait for permission. He spoke in a clear voice that carried to every corner of the room. "She signed under duress, Your Honor, and I have 3 witnesses who will swear to it." The room went still. Beckett, to his credit, did not move. Price went very still in his chair. Aldrich peered over his spectacles and said, "Marshal Holloway, you are making an extremely serious allegation." "Yes, sir, I am, and I can prove it." He walked to the front of the room. He brought Gerald Potts up first. Gerald spoke in his measured schoolteacher's voice about the similar pressure he had received from Beckett's organization, the offers, the implied threats, the interference with his water access. Price cross-examined him aggressively, but Gerald Potts had spent 20 years teaching schoolchildren and was not a man who was rattled by aggressive questioning. He brought Andres Vega up second. Andres testified with the deliberate care of a man who had thought every word through in advance, describing the visits from Beckett's men, the implied consequence, the pattern that matched exactly what had been applied to Inez Winslow. When Price attempted to suggest that Andres's recollection might be unreliable, Andres looked at the lawyer with a quiet dignity that made something in the room shift perceptibly. Then he brought James Calloway up. The room recognized James. Several of Beckett's associates present in the room sat forward slightly. Beckett himself turned his head, just fractionally, which was the most visible reaction he had shown. James Calloway testified to exactly what he had seen on the night of the 17th of June. Cord Delaney between the woman and her door with his hand on his gun. Dalton Price with the document. The rider keeping the ranch hand secured at the barn. Inez with the pen in her hand and the controlled terror of a woman facing a trap with no visible exit. He spoke plainly and without embellishment, and when he was done, he looked at no one in particular and sat with his hands folded. Price cross-examined James for 20 minutes with the intensity of someone trying to find a crack in a foundation. He asked about James's employment, about his reasons for testifying, about the conversations he had had with the marshal prior to the hearing. James answered everything directly. He did not claim to be without bias. He claimed only that he had been there, had seen what he had seen, and that it was the truth. Aldrich called a recess. During the recess, Elijah stood outside the trading post in the hard morning sun, and Frederick Hale came out to stand beside him. "The judge has a problem," Frederick said quietly. "If he rules for Beckett, he has 3 sworn witnesses saying the opposite of the official record. In a territory moving toward statehood, that is a significant exposure." "It needs to be enough," Elijah said. Frederick looked at him. "You did something significant in there, Marshal, standing up like that. A man in your position with Aldrich on the other side." "I gave my word," Elijah said simply. When the recess ended, Judge Aldrich took the bench with the expression of a man who had done some uncomfortable arithmetic during the break. He heard final statements from both sides. Then he removed his spectacles, cleaned them with methodical slowness, replaced them, and sat for a moment in the silence of a man composing his actual thoughts rather than reading from a prepared script. "The testimony of 3 independent witnesses," he said finally, "regarding the events of June 17th, establishes with sufficient credibility that the circumstances under which the document in question was presented to Miss Winslow did not constitute a free and voluntary contract. The transfer document is therefore voided as having been obtained under conditions of coercion. The Winslow homestead remains under the legal ownership of Inez Winslow, and any further attempts to acquire said property through the methods described in testimony today will be treated as criminal harassment under territorial law." He set down his gavel. The room broke open. Beckett stood and said one quiet word to Price, who was already gathering his papers. They left without looking at Inez or Elijah, and there was something in the way they left, the controlled speed of it, that told Elijah they were not finished. But they were finished for today, and today mattered enormously. He turned and found Inez already beside him. She had come from her table with Frederick Hale still processing the ruling behind her, and she stood in front of Elijah with her dark eyes bright with something that was more than relief, something that was triumph and exhaustion and gratitude, and a complete unwillingness to cry in public, all held together in one expression. "You did it," she said. "We did it," he said. Gerald Potts shook Elijah's hand with the solemnity of a man completing a significant commitment. Andres Vega nodded at him with a small smile that meant more than most speeches. James Calloway made his way through the room toward the door, and Elijah caught him before he got through it. "Come see me tomorrow morning," Elijah said. "I'll take you to meet Potts and Vega." James looked at him with the slightly dazed expression of a man still determining whether what had happened was real. "Thank you, Marshal," he said. "You did the hard part," Elijah said. When the room had largely emptied, and Frederick Hale had gone to file the court's ruling with the land registry, and Ruth Aldcott and Tamaz and Felix, who had been in the back of the room for the entire proceedings, had filed out with expressions of profound satisfaction, Elijah and Inez were left more or less alone in the pine board room with the morning light coming through the windows. He looked at her for a moment. The promise he had made the evening before was present between them. "I believe I said I had something to ask you," he said. She looked up at him with the slight lift at the corner of her mouth that was not quite a smile but preceded one. "You did say that." "Inez Winslow," he said. "I have spent the better part of 7 months discovering that you are the most remarkable person I have ever met in my life. I would consider it the great privilege of my life to spend the rest of it beside you. Would you be willing to marry me?" She looked at him with those dark, assessing eyes, and there was a long enough pause that anyone watching might have been concerned, but Elijah knew what was in that pause. It was her characteristically thorough method of considering a thing from all angles before committing, not because she was uncertain, but because she was serious. "I will ask you one question first," she said. "All right," he said. Do you intend to be the kind of husband who attempts to manage a woman who has already demonstrated her capacity to manage herself? He looked at her steadily. I intend to be the kind of husband who stands beside that woman and backs her up when she needs it and gets out of her way when she doesn't. She smiled. The full one, the one that made her whole face change, and it was better than any of the previous times because this time it was for him specifically and without reservation. Then yes, she said, I will marry you, Elijah. They were married in September of 1882 in a ceremony conducted by a circuit preacher on the grounds of the Winslow homestead, beside the mesquite tree at the edge of the north pasture where Thomas Winslow had planted a bench and used to sit in the evenings to watch the light change over the Rio Salado. Andres Vega and his wife, Elena, came with all 7 children. Gerald Potts came and wore his best coat. Ruth Aldcott presided over the food with the thoroughness of a general and the satisfaction of a woman who had seen this coming since February. James Calloway came, sunburned and nervous in a borrowed jacket, because he had found work with Gerald Potts and was making a life that was his own now. Frederick Hale came and brought champagne from Santa Fe, which was the most expensive thing at the gathering, and which everyone agreed was entirely appropriate. Tomaz and Felix wore their good hats and stood straight with the contained pride of men who had been part of something worth being part of. Inez wore her mother's dress, altered to fit, which was white with small embroidered details at the cuffs that she had added herself over 3 evenings at the kitchen table. She came across the yard in the afternoon light on the arm of nobody, because her father was gone and she was not a woman who needed to be given away. And she walked to where Elijah stood under the mesquite tree and took his hands and looked at him with everything present in her face. He looked at her with everything present in his. The preacher said the words, and they said the words back. And when it was done and Elijah kissed his wife for the first time as her husband, the gathering broke into the kind of noise that contained 7 of Andres Vega's children, Ruth Aldcott's announcement that the food was ready, and Gerald Potts blowing his nose loudly into a handkerchief, which was Gerald Potts's version of being moved. After the meal and the champagne and the dancing, which went on past dark with lanterns strung between the porch posts and a fiddle player that Tomaz Reyes turned out to have been concealing for the entirety of his acquaintance with anyone present, people began to drift to their horses and wagons in the warm September night. Ruth Aldcott embraced Inez with the fierceness of a woman who had watched this young person carry an immense weight alone and was now releasing some of the vigilance that had gone along with that watching. Your father would have been very pleased, Ruth said against Inez's hair. Inez held on for a moment. I know he would, she said. Elijah found Andres Vega at his wagon, settling his younger children among the blankets for the drive home. Andres shook Elijah's hand and said, You are a good man, Marshal. This territory needs more of them. It needs more men like you, Elijah said honestly. The last wagon rolled out in the dark and the yard went quiet and the stars came out completely, the full brilliant assembly of them that was only possible out here far from any lamplit town. Elijah and Inez stood on the porch and let the quiet settle. Well, she said. Well, he agreed. She turned and looked at him in the warm darkness, and the expression on her face was something he had not quite seen before, something opened and unhidden and full of a simple happiness that had not been there a year ago, when she had been carrying everything alone. He put his arm around her and she leaned into his side, and they stood like that under the September stars on the land that was hers and now also theirs, the land that her father had loved, and that they would tend together, and the Rio Salado ran quiet in the distance with the sound of water that had been here long before any of them and would be here long after. The matter of Beckett was not fully over, because men like Beckett are not undone in a single morning in a trading post. But the court ruling had gone into the territorial record, and 3 witnesses had sworn to the truth of it, and the pattern of coercion was now documented in a way that exposed Beckett to the kind of scrutiny that made quiet withdrawal more attractive than continued confrontation. Within 6 months of the hearing, Beckett shifted his attention and his resources to a railroad land deal further north that did not require him to fight a documented public record and a territorial marshal with 3 witnesses and a personal investment in the outcome. The dam on the tributary was removed. The tributary ran free. The third well on the Winslow property filled again, slowly, over the course of that winter, coming back the way water comes back when the thing blocking it is finally taken away. Elijah kept his badge and his office in redemption, and the daily work of the law continued, because the territory was always generating new versions of the same essential problems that came from the collision of ambition and geography, and the perpetual negotiation over what the rules were going to be, and who they were going to apply to. He was good at the work, and he found that being good at it was more satisfying now, because there was a place to come home to, and a person waiting, and the evening light on the homestead that he had stopped thinking of as merely the Winslow land and had started thinking of, quietly and privately, as home. Inez continued to run the homestead with the same precision she had always brought to it. She hired a second full-time ranch hand in the spring following the wedding, a quiet Navajo man named Hosteen, who proved to be one of the most capable horsemen any of them had ever seen. She negotiated better prices for her cattle at the Las Cruces market by the straightforward method of knowing exactly what the cattle were worth, and being willing to wait for someone who agreed with her assessment. She and Elena Vega became friends in the way that women who recognize each other's quality become friends, a relationship of mutual respect and genuine liking that grew over meals and occasional visits, and the shared labor of the kind of life they were both living. In the autumn of 1883, Inez told Elijah, on a Tuesday evening at the kitchen table over coffee, with the same direct manner she brought to every significant piece of information, that she was expecting a child. Elijah set his coffee cup down. He looked at her. He was aware of his heart doing something complicated in his chest and his face arranging itself into an expression that he suspected was going to embarrass him if Ruth Aldcott walked in. "Are you well?" he said, which was the first thing he could find that was coherent. "I am very well," she said, the corner of her mouth lifted. "You look somewhat overwhelmed." "I am somewhat overwhelmed," he admitted. "Good," she said. "So am I." It seemed fair for both of us. He reached across the table and took both her hands in his, and she let him hold them and looked at him with that dark-eyed assessment that had been seeing into him since the beginning. "A child," he said. "A child," she confirmed. He brought her hands up and pressed them against his face for a moment, and she let him, and the kitchen was warm around them, and the desert night was outside the window, and the lamplight made everything amber and good. Their son was born in the spring of 1884. They named him Thomas for her father, and his middle name was James, for a young man who had chosen the difficult right thing over the comfortable wrong one. Thomas James Holloway came into the world on a Tuesday morning in April with the decisive energy of someone who had already made up his mind about things, and Ruth Aldcott received him with the practiced calm of a woman who had attended several births in her life. And Elijah, who had faced situations that most men would have found impossible without visible distress, sat outside the bedroom door for 3 hours in a state that could best be described as comprehensively terrified. When Ruth Aldcott came out and said the words that told him everything was safe and right, he stood and went to the door and looked inside. Inez was sitting against the pillows with the small wrapped person against her chest, and she looked up when he came in with an expression that was exhausted and radiant at the same time in a way he had never seen before on any face and thought he might never see again on any face other than hers. He crossed the room and sat beside her and looked at his son, who was small and red-faced and entirely perfect. "Thomas," he said, testing the name. "Thomas," she confirmed. The baby made a sound that was not really a word but communicated intent. Elijah put one careful finger against the small fist and felt it grip, which was the most extraordinary thing that had ever happened to him, and he decided then that the world contained more than he had previously estimated. "You are extraordinary," he said to Inez. "I know," she said, and then smiled to take the edge off it, and then did not take the edge off it at all because it was true and they both knew it. James Calloway rode out to the homestead when word reached Redemption. He came to the door, hat in hand, and was allowed in by Ruth, who had been expecting him, and he stood in the kitchen and said, "Congratulations, Marshal, and to you, ma'am." When told the child's middle name, he looked at the floor for a moment and then looked up, and there was something in his face that did not quite make it into his expression but was there in his eyes, a kind of moved and startled quality. "That's an honor," he said quietly. "It's the truth," Elijah said. Gerald Potts wrote a letter that took him 3 drafts and was still formal and a little stiff, but contained genuine warmth underneath the formality. Andres and Elena Vega arrived with food, because Elena Vega's response to any significant life event was always food, and it was always excellent food, and Inez held their youngest child, a girl of about 6 months, while Elena organized the kitchen. And for a moment the house contained the accumulated sound and warmth of people who had come through something difficult together and had built a life on the other side of it. Elijah stood in the doorway between the kitchen and the main room, watching all of this, and thought about January of 1881, when he had arrived in Redemption knowing no one, and about all the particular turns and choices that had led to this room in this moment, and about the completely unpredictable ways that the right decision repeated consistently eventually accumulated into something worth having. The years that followed built themselves on that foundation, with the patient accumulation of ordinary and extraordinary days. Thomas learned to walk on the porch boards in the summer of 1885 and promptly fell into the yard, picked himself up, and walked to the barn, which Elijah later told Inez was the truest possible indication of whose son he was. Inez expanded the cattle operation by another 60 head in 1886 after a particularly good market year, and the homestead's financial situation, which had been a source of constant pressure before the hearing, became stable and then genuinely solid. Elijah served as territorial marshal through 1887, and then accepted a deputy position with the newly formed county sheriff's office in Las Cruces when the county reorganized its law enforcement structure. The work was different, but the commitment was the same, and he continued doing it with the same methodical attention to detail and the same inability to look away from an injustice that had defined him since before Inez knew his name. In the autumn of 1886, their second child arrived, a daughter this time, with Elijah's dark hair and Inez's eyes, which was an exact and extremely effective combination. They named her Clara Ruth, the second name for Ruth Aldcott, who upon hearing this sat down heavily in the nearest chair and said nothing for a full minute, and then said, with uncharacteristic emotion, "That is the finest gift I have ever received," and then stood up and found something to do in the kitchen because she was not about to weep in front of people. Clara turned out to have both parents' stubbornness simultaneously, which created some interesting situations as she grew older, and Thomas at 2.5 was both delighted and somewhat baffled by the arrival of a person who had not been there before and appeared to have strong opinions about everything within her reach. In the evenings, after the children were in their beds and the day's work was done, Elijah and Inez developed the habit of sitting on the porch together in the way they had first sat on the porch steps on the night he had driven away Beckett's men, except now there were 2 glasses of whiskey instead of residual terror, and the desert dark was familiar and safe rather than charged with threat. They talked about everything. About the children and the cattle and the territory, which was moving steadily toward statehood and changing in ways that were sometimes good and sometimes complicated, and always interesting to discuss with a person who thought about things carefully. About history and the nature of justice, and what it meant to build something in a landscape that was old beyond any of their comprehension. About her father and the notebook with the observations about water and hawks. About Dodge City and the war and all the things that had preceded this. About ordinary things, What Hosteen had said about the horses. What Frederick Hale, now an established territorial attorney in Las Cruces with a family of his own, had written in his last letter. What Ruth had planned for the week's cooking. What Thomas had done that day that was either very clever or very concerning depending on how you looked at it. About the land, always the land, the Rio Salado running through it, the aquifer below it with its old patterns, the hawks circling the mesas the way they had circled for longer than anyone's memory, the morning light and the evening light, and the way the desert bloomed for 2 brief weeks in the spring with a wildness of color that seemed like an excess, a gift given for no practical reason, just because the world was sometimes capable of extravagance. Inez kept her father's notebook. She began adding to it. Her observations were as precise as his, and ranged as widely, from notes on the behavior of the water table in the years since the dam had been removed to observations about the plant communities on the North Pasture, to sketches in the margins of birds she saw and wanted to remember. It was becoming something larger than a single person's record. It was becoming a record of a place over time, kept by people who had loved it. Elijah found her adding to it one evening and sat beside her and read over her shoulder for a while without saying anything, and then she looked up and found him reading and did not close the notebook. "You can read it," she said. "It is not a secret." "I know," he said. He had read sections of her editions before, with her knowledge and permission, but there was something different about reading it with her there, with the warm weight of her present beside him. He read a description she had written of a storm the previous spring, a paragraph that was precise and lyrical at the same time in a way that reminded him of her father's writing and was also entirely her own. He read her notes on the water levels from the past year. He read, near the end, a passage she had written that was not about the land at all, but about a specific evening on the porch, described with the same careful observation she applied to storms and hawks. The evening described was one he recognized. It was from the previous summer. Thomas had been asleep and Clara had just gone down, and they had been sitting in the warm dark talking about something he could not now remember, and she had written about the quality of the light and the sound of the Rio Salado in the distance and the sense of a life completely inhabited, which was how she phrased it, a life completely inhabited, and at the end she had written his name. He sat with that for a moment. "Inez," he said. She was watching him. She knew what he had read. "That is what it is," she said simply. "I wanted it recorded." He looked at her for a long moment, and then he took the pen from beside the notebook, and because she did not stop him, wrote his own name below hers on that page, just the 2 names together, which said everything without requiring anything further. She looked at the page. Then she looked at him. Then she leaned over and kissed him on the jaw in that particular way she had, the one that communicated complete and uncomplicated affection, without any of the self-consciousness that she brought to more formal expressions of feeling. And he put his arm around her, and she settled into his side, and they sat with the notebook open between them, and the lamp burning, and the sound of their children sleeping in the house around them, and the desert outside the window going about its ancient business. New Mexico Territory became a subject of statehood discussion throughout the late 1880s and into the 1890s, a process long and complicated and full of the usual political machinery. And Elijah watched it with the particular interest of a man who had spent years trying to make the law work in a place where it was still being invented. When statehood finally came, much later than this particular story required, it would be built on the accumulated decisions of thousands of people who had stayed and worked and insisted on things being done properly. And Elijah counted himself among them, and Andres Vega, and Gerald Potts, and James Calloway, who had found his own life and his own land, and Inez above all, who had refused to let a man with more money than conscience consume what her father had built. The story that had begun in a courtroom in the spring of 1882 resolved itself not in a single moment, but in many moments, accumulated over years, each one ordinary and each one necessary. The land beside the Rio Salado, 460 acres with the clean water running through it and the hawks circling overhead, continued to exist because someone had refused to sign it away, and someone else had stood up and said the truth out loud, and 3 people had been willing to swear to it. And because of all of that, 2 people had found each other, and a life had been made in the place where a loss had been barely averted, and the notebook with the observations about water and hawks grew thicker year by year with the record of what had been built on that foundation. One morning in the late spring of 1888, when Thomas was 4 and Clara was nearly 2 and the desert was in its brief exuberant bloom, Elijah came out of the barn to find Inez standing at the fence of the north pasture watching the land. He came to stand beside her and followed her gaze out across the grass and the distant mesquitas and the pale blue sky above the mesa. "What are you looking at?" he asked. "Everything," she said. He looked at it with her, the cattle in the south pasture, the garden behind the house that was just beginning to show green above the soil, the line of the Rio Salado visible in the middle distance as a darker stripe of vegetation following the water, the sky that went on without any apparent intention of stopping. She turned and looked at him. Her expression had the quality of the moment before something important is said, and he recognized it and waited. "I am very happy," she said. He looked at her. She said it as a fact, with the same directness she brought to water table readings and market prices, not as a performance or a reassurance but as an observation about the actual condition of things. "So am I," he said. She nodded, as if they had confirmed something in the ledger. Then she turned back to the view and he stood beside her, and the desert did what it always did, which was exist with a completeness that did not require anyone's observation to be complete, though it was perhaps enhanced by it. Thomas appeared from around the corner of the house at a purposeful trot, heading in the direction of the barn with the look of a small person who had a specific plan that no adult was yet aware of. Elijah intercepted him with one arm, sweeping him up without breaking his own posture, and Thomas immediately attempted to communicate his barn plan with the urgency it deserved. "In a moment," Elijah said. Thomas registered the landscape his parents were looking at with the brief, polite interest of a 4-year-old humoring adults, and then redirected his energy toward escaping the arm. Inez laughed, and Elijah laughed, and Thomas, pleased to have produced this effect, laughed too, and the sound of it went out across the Winslow land in the spring morning, across the 460 acres that had been kept and would be kept, along the Rio Salado that ran clean now, under the sky that the hawks were already drawing their long circles in, as they had before any of them arrived and would after all of them were gone. And the laughter was swallowed by the desert morning as the desert morning swallowed everything, not erasing it but holding it, the way a place holds the people who have lived in it and loved it, invisibly and permanently, and without any need to be thanked. For it, everything that had been threatened was intact, everything that had been earned was present, and everything that had been built from courage and stubbornness, and 3 witnesses willing to swear to the truth, from a marshal who had kept his word and a woman who had never given up the land her father loved, stood in the warm May light on the Rio Salado in exactly the condition that justified every difficult thing that had been required to bring it here. Which was to say, it stood in the condition of being fully, completely, and without reservation good.